Well, here we come to maybe something that you're not as familiar with, so let's unpack this, discovering the messiness of the ancient Near Eastern world. What do we mean by messiness? Well, let's talk about this with 3 C's. We want to seize the day here with with a little bit of, again, some mnemonic devices here. Our first C is that of contextualization, that there are radically different conditions in the ancient Near East than what we see in our own modern world. And then consideration. How would we implement some of these modern ideas that we're so familiar with and so comfortable with in this kind of an alien setting? And then concession, and how God deals with people who have hardened hearts in the ancient Near East. So let's unpack this. Here's an Old Testament scholar, Bruce Birch, when it comes to contextualization. He says that these biblical texts are rooted in a cultural context utterly unlike our own, with moral presuppositions and categories that are alien and in some cases repugnant to our modern sensibilities. Here's another statement by Oliver O'Donovan, who says that he urges us to show something of a suspension of moral judgment to allow an ancient society constructed on different terms from any we know to express its own moral priorities. It's very easy for us to do what C.S. Lewis warned about. He says it's easy to be a chronological snob, thinking we're so much better than those people back then. Look at how much more superior we are than they are. And rather than allowing them, way back in the ancient Near East, to be in this process of historical development, rather than superimposing or imposing our own ways upon them, thinking that maybe if I lived back then, I would have known better. I would have done a lot better than those folks back then. Alexander Pope, the poet, said, "We think our fathers fools, so wise we grow. Our wiser sons, no doubt, will think us so." So be careful about being that chronological snob. Let's just take these things on their own rather than engaging this kind of comparison point for point. So here's something for consideration. How would you implement democracy in difficult places even today, let alone in the ancient Near East? Think about trying to bring, say, democracy to a place like Saudi Arabia. What would be required to change a certain mindset where women might be whipped for having been raped? No instigation of their own, but because they're allegedly bringing dishonor to their families, they are whipped, and often the men get off with light or no sentences or punishments at all. What would you do to bring change to a situation? Well, you can be sure that it would have to be something incremental, and it would be a very difficult task to undertake, wouldn't it? Think about God stepping into this kind of a situation and implementing changes. It's not the sort of thing that's going to happen overnight, which brings us to our third C, concession. That God's often engaging in the utilization of methods for people with hardened hearts. One Old Testament scholar, John Goldengay, at Fuller Seminary, says, God gets his hands dirty to a certain point, that he works within a fallen world, though not the original product of his own pure hands. There's a messiness on the ground that God is stepping into and working with. So God begins where his hard people are, with polygamy, patriarchy, warfare, and so forth. And he reminds Jesus reminds his own audience in Matthew chapter 19 that God permitted certain things like divorce because of the hardness of human hearts. And what God is doing is stepping into history, working with people who are far from perfect. In fact, they are stubborn and rebellious, but yet God chooses them and works with them and moves them in a redemptive direction. So there are hardened hearts, but we also see that God is engaging with a heavy heart. Some of the commands that God gives are not given with delight. They're given with great reluctance, with great sadness of heart, with a grieved heart. God says in the book of Ezekiel, how I've been hurt by their adulterous hearts. God is often grieved. It's not because he is afflicting people with a willing heart that he is meting out judgments, but rather he desires to forgive. He desires to relent. He is willing to pull back on the judgments that he has threatened against people. You think of the book of Jonah, where that is indeed taking place. In the same way, Ian Provan says, God accommodates himself to the reality on the ground in the ancient Near East. God doesn't legislate his kingdom to being and is often acting in a kind of pragmatic way, working with where people are, though without engaging in unjust commands or evil commands or something like that. So that's a little bit of the messiness of the ancient Near East.